listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Last week, Sydney played host to TikTok's biggest awards ceremony, a night of huge crowds, celebrity guests, and a history-making creator of the year. But while the headlines were focused on all of that, another story was erupting online.
I've covered red carpets for a really long time, and I think chaos is essentially part of the job, but hostility and aggression is not.
That deep dive into the racist allegations surrounding the 2025 TikTok Awards is coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, let's get into the headlines with Sasha Barbagat. It's Wednesday, the 3rd of December.
Hello, Chris, and to you listening. We are a week out from banning children from social media in Australia, and new apps are now springing up and soaring in downloads as kids look to get around the new rules. Two in particular have surged in popularity, Lemonade and Yope, which sell themselves as photo-sharing apps, with the East Safety Commission writing to both, asking them to self-assess to work out if they fall under these new laws. While the Communications Minister, Annika Wells, says new apps popping up are in the government's sights.
Should any particular platform like Lemonade, like LinkedIn, become the new source, I will not hesitate to act.
LinkedIn for kids, that's a wild prediction there, but all right.
Yeah, apparently if kids start using LinkedIn, LinkedIn's going to get in trouble.
Not to. Now, look, the legislation which comes into effect on December 10 requires tech companies to constantly monitor if their programs will be affected by the restrictions. And if you're wondering what an app has to do to be captured by this ban, it includes whether it has features like uploading and sharing photos and videos, commenting, and the ability to connect with strangers. Meantime, the minister will make a speech at the National Press Club today, conceding the ban won't work perfectly from day one.
Yeah, and Chris, this speech is being seen as kind of tempering expectations, with the Australian public set to be scrutinising this bold policy as it comes into effect. And judging whether it's effective or not, Wells, in her address, will warn social media companies to brace for $50 million fines if they haven't managed to kick kids off their platforms within the first 6 months of the ban. So basically saying, look, we're going to do our best, but it's not going to be perfect from day one. Kind of giving that 6-month marker, I think, is when we can expect maybe the government to give a bit of an update as to how it's been going and whether it's been successful, whether these apps have actually managed to kick these kids off. And a stat that has been floating around with this story is that more than 85% of 8 to 15-year-olds are on social media in Australia, which is that's a huge amount of people that are going to be kicked off the platform. So we know that YouTube, TikTok, X and Kick haven't actually made public their plans on how they're going to get these children off their apps. But Meta, so Facebook, Insta and Threads have told users what to expect from next week.
The Liberal Party is considering whether to censor parts of an internal review into this year's historic election loss out of concern they may be too embarrassing to be made public. The yet-to-be-released probe was commissioned nearly 6 months ago and wrapped up in recent days, with leaks suggesting Peter Dutton's embrace of Trumpist policies turned voters off the coalition. Something of particular concern was his decision to make NT Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price the Shadow Minister for Government Efficiency, a role inspired by Elon Musk's now-dissolved Doge.
According to 9 newspapers, the report's release got pushed so it wouldn't draw more attention to internal problems within the coalition in the final sitting week of Parliament, with Susan Lee, Angus Taylor and Andrew Hastie among those reportedly not keen for it to be made fully public. And while the report isn't expected to name them specifically, it will detail the failure of Dutton and key members of the coalition. Now remember, Lee was his deputy, Taylor was the shadow treasurer and Hastie was the defence spokesperson. So 3 roles that were very important and very instrumental in the Liberal Party's failure at this year's election.
Yeah, and something that senior campaign members were talking about was this Trump effect, this idea that, you know, in the first 100 days of his second presidency, there was sweeping support for Trump, but that all started to shift about 100 days in. Remember, he promised to end the Ukraine war on day one. That didn't end. He was then announcing tariffs left, right and centre. So there was a lot of things going on in the US that, you know, were working against Trump. So then when Dutton was trying to import those policies here, we saw that disconnect flowing and polling showed us that at the time. And what an insider said is what was once working totally flipped after those first 100 days. So yeah, very interesting to see. I'm keen to get my eyes on this report. I'll actually read it in full because I'm very curious to see what internally they think went wrong.
The inquest into the deadly SeaWorld helicopter crash has heard one of the pilots had a breakdown days before the tragedy over workplace stress. Ashley Jenkinson was one of 4 people killed when 2 choppers from the theme park collided in midair on the Gold Coast in January of 2023.
His fiancée has given evidence to the court revealing he took cocaine the day before the crash and he'd broken down in the weeks before. Jenkinson reportedly told his partner she didn't know how much pressure he was under. At the time, he'd been working long hours to try to get a new fleet of helicopters ready for the busy holiday period.
Some context here as well. A damning report from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau that was released earlier this year had highlighted that the helicopters in the SeaWorld fleet, which were relatively new, had major issues, including with pilot visibility, safety lighting and radio equipment. Now, an autopsy on Jenkinson did find small amounts of cocaine in his system, but it's not believed to have impaired him on the day of the crash.
New research has revealed one of Labor's key measures to stamp out problem gambling has done little to deter addicts. The reform, which makes it illegal for gamblers to use credit cards to place bets, saw most just switch to using their own money, like cash or debit cards, according to a study by E61 Institute. It also left open a range of loopholes that can and have been exploited, like using credit cards to get cash advances or taking out personal loans to fund the habit. The research finding it did make gambling more inconvenient and likely deterred casual bettors instead.
Yeah, the Albanese government has been facing pressure for years, Chris, to enact tougher gambling reforms, particularly a complete ban on advertising. That conversation has been rolling around for a couple of years, and Labor has been considering the reform with talk we could see an announcement early next year. However, with this social media ban coming into effect, there is talk apparently that Labor's going, oh, well, that'll stop young people from seeing gambling ads online, which I think is a bit of a cop-out, really. Hello, people still watch TV. People are still exposed to that stuff.
You still see the billboards and you see all the betting brands on jerseys and apparel all around Australia.
And we know that kids are watching sport, and that's where a lot of the gambling ads are played because people watching sport love to make a punt. And also remember, the gambling companies have powerful lobby groups behind them, and revenue from the habit goes straight into both state and federal coffers. So that's a lot of money. And to give that a figure, Aussies dropped more than $31.5 billion on gambling habits in the 2022-23 financial year. Obviously, that's not all going to governments, but they get a nice healthy chunk of that. That's around $1,500 per adult in Australia. It's a wild amount of money.
And the Matildas have ended their playing year on a high, beating New Zealand 2-0 in front of 15,000 fans in Adelaide last night. In her first game back after copping a one-match suspension, Alana Kennedy opened the scoring 19 minutes into the friendly.
Well, that is dazzling. It's a wonderful hit from Alana Kennedy, who has found her way back into the starting side, and that goal has a bit of feeling behind it.
And that was followed up by Hayley Rasso, who found the back of the net in the second half.
I love playing for Australia. It's my happy place and I feel like I thrive here. So, I'm delighted to get those goals, but even happier to get the win leading into the Asian Cup.
Shouldn't sound that happy to me, but anyway. The bigger news, well, no, it's not the bigger news. The Tillies won, amazing, but also great was Sam Kerr. She was back for her first game back on home soil and in the Tillies jersey since 2023. She was actually meant to play in their first friendly against New Zealand last Friday, but missed out because of a calf injury. They did win that game 5-0 without her anyway. And last night she played the first half, but sat out the second. So a nice slow reintroduction for Sam. And at full time, she signed her boots and gave them to 2 lucky kids in the stands.
1 or 2? Separately.
Yeah, it's so cool to see Sam back on Aussie soil playing football. We love to see it.
Yeah, and just actually a little note there on the back end of the Hayley Rasso audio that we played. Look, this was their last set of games before the Women's Asian Cup kicks off next March. Australia is hosting that, so there are a bunch of games that we can look forward to. And Hayley Rasso, of course, though her tone might not reflect it, she, is quite excited, I would say.
Are you sure? I'm not convinced.
For the Women's Asian Cup. That is it for our headlines for today. Coming up next is my deep dive into the racist allegations surrounding the TikTok awards. Stick around, that deep dive is coming up for you next. This time last week, TikTok made history for a bunch of reasons. It hosted what it described as its biggest awards ceremony yet, the 2025 TikTok Awards for Australia and New Zealand.
Are we ready to jump, TikTok? And I was dancing too.
Sophie Monk hosted. Over 5,000 people, including People magazine's sexiest man alive, Jonathan Bailey, rocked up. A record-breaking 6.4 million votes were cast, which the platform says is 3 million more than last year. And Tongan creator Eli Matangi, aka Javier676, became the first Pacific Islander and man to take out the top gong, Creator of the Year.
And the winner is... It's Javier!
And while most of the coverage ticked off the essential who, what, where, when and why, there was a whole other story playing out on socials that TikTok Australia has since responded to.
TikTok Australia, the way your staff treat black creators is absolutely disgusting.
He looked at us and basically refused to take our photos. We're like, okay, well, like, what's going on?
This didn't just happen to us. They also refused to take a photo of a black nominee.
Mibenge Nsenduluka is an independent journalist and founder of Backcover Media who's been covering this story. Mibenge, welcome back to the briefing. There's been multiple allegations of racism that have come to light since the TikTok Awards. Can you talk us through them?
What happened in a nutshell is that black creators came forward claiming that they were denied red carpet access while white creators were allowed to walk through without any problems. So that's the core issue. In fact, one photographer was actually caught on video telling a black creator, "We don't need your photo. What are we going to do with it?" You know, it wasn't just a mix-up. This was deliberate exclusion. So moments like this don't come out of nowhere. They come from systems that have normalised whose visibility matters and whose doesn't.
I want to talk about TikTok Australia's response. They've put out a formal statement on Sunday, but before that, they actually sent you a statement because you've been covering this story. What was in that statement that you received?
Yeah, so TikTok referred to extreme weather, which we know to be true. This meant that they had to take the red carpet from outdoors to indoors. This essentially halved the number of people walking the red carpet. So there wasn't enough space is what they were trying to say. And while this was true, it didn't really land well because it didn't really explain what we know to be, or what a lot of people are saying was racism, essentially, on the red carpet. So it didn't explain why these black creators were subjected to this differential treatment. So there are still a lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, and then we fast forward to Sunday where they put out an official statement on their TikTok page. They do talk about those unforeseen logistical challenges, things to do with the weather. And then they have this little slab here where they say, "We sincerely apologise to anyone who felt excluded or uncomfortable at this year's TikTok Awards. Our amazing and diverse community is what makes TikTok great, and the awards are designed to celebrate that." What do you make of that statement that followed up from the statement you received?
Yeah, look, it's good that they apologised, even though they didn't explicitly call out the racism. It's good that they're, committed to investigating. It's good that they said that they'll no longer work with the photographers in question, but removing contractors is just the beginning, not the solution. So this moment is an opportunity for TikTok and honestly the whole media industry to interrogate their systems, their partners, and the values baked into their event structures.
Now, for anyone who might have missed the exchange with one of the creators, we'll play a little grab now.
This is for all the media.
Well, that's not our fault. That's the information.
Yeah, but this has nothing to do with you. We don't need your photo. We're not, they're not going to. What are they going to do with your photo?
Wow.
It's not going anywhere.
That's crazy. That is rude as
A lot of red carpet photographers I've worked with, unfortunately, do speak to people in this way, and that's a point being made online at the moment. But what was it about these incidents that take their behaviour from rudeness to racism?
Yeah, so I agree with you, Chris. I've covered red carpets for, a really long time, and I think chaos is essentially part of the job, but hostility and aggression is not. In another instance involving Florence Baitio, who's a beauty influencer, she was actually a nominee. She also says that she was approached by a separate photographer who was also aggressive and essentially berated her on the red carpet.
Me and this other creator, she's also a person of colour, we went on the carpet to get our photos taken. And there was this photographer, he didn't take a photo, and then he was telling me to get off. And then the other content creator, she went and told one of the workers at TikTok. I think they went and told him. So then he was literally marching at me.
So this kind of unprofessional behaviour is just unacceptable. The differential treatment needs to be called out. I'm glad that these influencers came forward. It's not easy to do so because, as we know with previous experiences or previous incidents rather, we have seen people who are often demonised for speaking up. So it takes a lot of courage to speak up, and I'm glad that they did. And I think that TikTok realizes that the photographer's behavior did cross a line, which is why they've now cut ties with them. And I think that's the right move.
You mentioned there a little bit of the backlash that people do face when they speak up. And in this scenario, we've seen a similar thing happen. There have been a bunch of comments defending the photographers or reinterpreting their motivations, saying that they're not racist. What do you make of those comments that are defending their actions in that way?
Yeah, look, and I've also seen, in addition to that, I've seen people saying, well, maybe the photographers just wanted to shoot big names. Maybe these creators weren't famous enough, so to speak. But the problem is people of colour, have been ignored in this industry for a really long time. It's actually symptomatic of symbolic annihilation, whereby the media ignores, trivializes, or condemns certain groups of people and essentially erases them from the public consciousness. So, yeah, I think that this is a much deeper problem. I think people are sort of focusing on surface level arguments, but if we look at the deeper issues, which are structural racism that are, prevalent throughout different industries, including media, I think, these are really important questions that we need to have and how we can go about making the necessary changes to ensure that everyone's included.
When we use words like structured racism, I understand it. You understand it, but for someone listening who might not understand what that looks like and how that permeates an industry, can you explain that a little further?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is all by design. The people who are the decision makers, the people who are at the top, essentially the people who are creating these lists that the photographers use to determine who they're going to photograph, the editors, the producers, they tend to focus on white talent. So we've heard time and again these stories of exceptional talent here in Australia, people of colour from various backgrounds, including First Nations talent, having to move abroad because they don't get the recognition or the opportunities that they get overseas. So what happens is that the people at the top often focus on people who look like them, which means that the same headlines and essentially the same opportunities go to the same group of people. So we see a lot of whitewashing. We see a lot of people of colour being ignored and sidelined. And so this is what people are calling out, is that, people of colour have been ignored for decades in this country. So it's time for change, and people are really calling out the media and wanting people to finally acknowledge that.
When we do talk about the media's coverage here, if you were to search TikTok awards and racism, up until a few days ago, I think yours was the only one that would come up on Google. On TikTok, though, it's a very different story. TikTok racism, TikTok award racism was coming up, and there was a plethora of videos talking about it and discussing it, and the comment section was filled with people who had opinions and thoughts on it. Why do you think we're seeing that difference between what Australian media is covering and the stories that are being told and the way that they're being told on platforms like TikTok?
I think that mainstream media tends to ignore, people of colour, as I said. So our stories don't get told. A lot of them have a default position, and that position is that, a lot of these people don't care about stories that call out racism. So I think that the default position for some of them is actually that hate sells. So they don't make it their duty to prioritise these stories, unfortunately. So a lot of independent journalists like myself have had to sort of branch out of corporate media and create our own lanes in order to tell our stories, because quite frankly, mainstream media just don't care to do so. But thankfully, times are changing. Social media has had a significant impact in the way that we tell our stories. And we do have a very broad reach. I think my story got, more than 500,000 views in 24 hours, which is just incredible. So there is an appetite for it. People do want to hear these stories. People want the platforms to tell their stories. And I think times are changing.
I do agree with you that there is definitely an appetite to be talking about these stories and dissecting these stories and analysing it in the way that we have. However, I find in Australia we do have a tricky time talking about racism and having national conversations around racism. An example that springs to mind for me that's always stuck with me is the fact that in this country we have Harmony Day while the rest of the world has International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So the way that we frame it is very different to the global community. Why do you think we struggle so much in Australia to have conversations around racism?
We have a tendency to, sweep things under the rug per se. We don't like to be reminded of wrongdoing. A lot of people share guilt, so they don't like to be reminded because it makes them feel guilty. And I think that these are really valid questions. I think that in order to enforce change, we need to acknowledge what's going on. And that's where we sort of fall short, is that there is no acknowledgement a lot of the time. I think we need to take a long, hard look at history, be honest with ourselves, and that way we can come up with clear-cut solutions to ensure that the next generation don't have to face the same struggles.
Now, Mibenge, before we let you go, you run diversity workshops. You've worked in a bunch of different environments in this space. In your opinion, how can we do it better? And what advice would you have for a company like TikTok that they can start implementing before the 2026 awards?
I think they need to set clear behaviour standards and enforce them. So put things in writing, make it a policy and act quickly. They also need to hire diversely at every level. So when decision makers, photographers, editors, producers and event managers are diverse, it automatically becomes more inclusive. And then we also need real equity training. So not just tick a box workshops. Staff and contractors need ongoing cultural competency training that teaches what inclusion looks like in real life situations. So hire diversely, employ people with real lived experience and give them that platform to at least, be acknowledged and ensure that equality is enforced.
Mibenge, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks, Chris.
That was independent journalist and founder of Backcover Media, Mibenge Nsenduluka, speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. Now, we did mention TikTok's statement. They've posted their statement in full on their socials. A link to that will be in our show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode or you got something out of it, why not flick it over to a mate? I'm Spyrou. I'll catch you next time.